And now Hugh Laurie reads the first instalment of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's chilling mystery, The Hound of the Baskervilles.
Mr. Sherlock Holmes was seated at the breakfast table. I stood upon the hearthrug and picked up the stick which our visitor had left behind him the night before. It was a fine, bulbous-headed piece of wood of the sort which is known as a Penang lawyer. Just under the head was a broad silver band. To James Mortimer, M.R.C.S., from his friends of the C.C.H., was engraved upon it with the date 1884. Well, Watson, what do you make of it? Since we've been so unfortunate as to miss our visitor and have no notion of his errand, this accidental souvenir becomes of importance. Let me hear you reconstruct the man by an examination of it. I think, said I, that Dr. Mortimer is a successful elderly medical man, well esteemed, since those who know him give him this mark of their appreciation. Excellent, said Holmes. I think also that the probability is in favour of his being a country practitioner who does a great deal of his visiting on foot. Why so? Because this stick, though originally very handsome, has been so knocked about that I can hardly imagine a town practitioner carrying it. Really, Watson, you excel yourself, said Holmes, pushing back his chair and lighting a cigarette. I'm bound to say that in all accounts which you've been so good as to give of my own small achievements, you have habitually underrated your own abilities. He'd never said as much before, and I must admit that I was proud to think that I'd so far mastered his system as to apply it in a way which earned his approval. He now took the stick and carried it to the window, where he looked over it with a convex lens. Interesting, though elementary. Has anything escaped me? I asked with some self-importance. I'm afraid, my dear Watson, that most of your conclusions were erroneous, though the man is certainly a country practitioner, and he walks a good deal, but I believe he is a young man. The initials CCH bring Charing Cross Hospital to mind. Such a presentation is usually made when a doctor withdraws from the service of a hospital, in order to start in practice for himself. We believe there has been a change from a town hospital to a country practice. Now, you will observe that he couldn't have been on the staff of the hospital, since only a man well established in a London practice could hold such a position, and such a one would not drift into the country. He could, then, only have been a house surgeon, little more than a senior student, and he left 5 years ago. The date is on the stick. So your grave, middle-aged family practitioner vanishes into thin air, my dear Watson, and there emerges a fellow under 30, amiable, unambitious, absent-minded, and the possessor of a favourite dog, which I could describe by its teeth marks as being larger than a terrier and smaller than a mastiff. I laughed incredulously as Sherlock Holmes blew little wavering rings of smoke up to the ceiling. To check his theory, I reached for my medical directory. There were several Mortimers, but only one who could be our visitor. Mortimer James, M.R.C.S., Grimpen, Dartmoor, Devon. House surgeon from 1882 to 1884, Charing Cross Hospital. Winner of the Jackson Prize for Comparative Pathology. My companion turned from the window. It appears that the dog is a curly-haired spaniel. My dear fellow, how can you possibly know that? Simple. I see him on our doorstep. Now is the dramatic moment of fate, Watson, when you hear a step upon the stair which is walking into your life, and you know not whether for good or ill. Our visitor was a tall, thin man, clad in a professional but rather slovenly fashion. Though young, his long back was already bowed. Holmes greeted him. Now, what does Dr. James Mortimer, the man of science, ask of Sherlock Holmes, the specialist in crime? I came to you, Mr. Holmes, because I'm suddenly confronted with a most serious and extraordinary problem. The young man drew a manuscript from his breast pocket. This family paper was committed to my care by Sir Charles Baskerville, whose sudden and tragic death some 3 months ago created so much excitement in Devonshire. I may say that I was his personal friend as well as his medical attendant. He was a strong-minded man, sir, shrewd, practical, and as unimaginative as I am myself. Yet he took this document very seriously, and his mind was prepared for just such an end as did eventually overtake him. Holmes stretched out his hand for the manuscript, and I looked over his shoulder at the faded writing. At the head was written Baskerville Hall, and below, in large, scrawling figures, 1742. It read, "Of the origin of the Hound of the Baskervilles, there have been many statements. Yet as I come in a direct line from Hugo Baskerville, and as I had the story from my father, who also had it from his, I have set it down. Know then that in the time of the Great Rebellion, this manor of Baskerville was held by Hugo, a most wild, profane, and godless man. It chanced that this Hugo came to love the daughter of a yeoman who held lands near the estate. But the young maiden, being of good repute, would ever avoid him. So it came to pass that one Michaelmas, this Hugo, with 5 or 6 of his idle and wicked companions, stole down upon the farm and carried her off. They brought her to the hall and locked her in an upper chamber, while they sat down to a long carouse, as was their nightly custom. Meanwhile, the maiden escaped down the ivy which covered the south wall, and ran homeward across the moor. When Hugo discovered she was gone, he became as one that hath a devil. He cried that he would render his body and soul to the powers of evil, if he might but overtake the wench. One of the revellers suggested they should put the hounds upon her, whereat Hugo ran from the house, crying to his grooms that they should saddle his mare and unkennel the pack. He gave the hounds a kerchief of the maid's, and they set off in full cry. When the revellers had gathered their wits, they started in pursuit. They had gone a mile or 2 when they passed a shepherd on the moorlands. He was so crazed with fear that he could scarce speak, but he told them that he'd seen the unhappy maiden with the hounds on her track. "But I have seen more than that," said he, "for Hugo Baskerville passed me upon his black mare, and there ran mute behind him such a hound of hell as God forbid should ever be at my heels." The drunken squires carried on, but soon their skins turned cold, for there came a sound of galloping across the moor, and the black mare appeared with trailing bridle and empty saddle. The revellers rode close together now, for a great fear was on them. At last they came upon the hounds. These, though known for their valor, were whimpering in a cluster, their staring eyes gazing down the narrow valley before them. The moon was shining bright upon a clearing, and there lay the unhappy maid, where she'd fallen dead of fear and fatigue. But it was not the sight of her body, nor yet the body of Hugo Baskerville, which raised the hair upon their heads. Standing over Hugo and plucking at his throat, there stood a foul thing, a great black beast, shaped like a hound, yet larger than any one that ever mortal eye has rested upon. And even as they looked, the thing tore the throat out of Hugo Baskerville. When it finally turned its blazing eyes upon them, they shrieked with fear and rode for dear life, still screaming across the moor. One, it is said, died that very night of what he had seen, and the others were but broken men for the rest of their days. Such is the tale, my sons, of the coming of the hound, which is said to have plagued the family so sorely ever since. Many of our forefathers have suffered bloody and mysterious deaths, yet may we shelter in the infinite goodness of Providence, which would not forever punish the innocent beyond the 3rd or 4th generation. To that Providence, my sons, I hereby commend you, and I counsel you by way of caution to forbear from crossing the moor in those dark hours when the powers of evil are exalted. Dr. Mortimer stared at Holmes. "Well, do you find it interesting?" Holmes tossed the end of his cigarette into the fire. "To a collector of fairy tales?" Dr. Mortimer smiled and drew a folded newspaper from his pocket. "Well now, Mr. Holmes, we'll give you something a little more recent. Let me read from the Devon County Chronicle of June the 14th. The recent sudden death of Sir Charles Baskerville has cast a gloom over the county. Though Sir Charles had resided at Baskerville Hall for a comparatively short period, his amiability of character and extreme generosity had won great affection and respect. The circumstances connected with the death of Sir Charles cannot be said to have been entirely cleared up by the inquest, but at least enough has been done to dispose of those rumours to which local superstition has given rise. There is no reason to suspect foul play. The evidence of his butler, Barrymore, and his wife, corroborated by that of several friends and his medical attendant, Dr. James Mortimer, tends to show that Sir Charles's health has for some time been impaired, and points especially to some affection of the heart. The facts of the case are simple. On the 4th of June, Sir Charles had declared his intention of starting next day for London, and ordered Barrymore to prepare his luggage. Then he took a walk down the famous Yew Alley, as he did every night before bedtime. He never returned. At 12 o'clock, Barrymore became alarmed and went in search of his master. The day had been wet, and his footmarks were easily traced down the alley. Halfway down is a gate which leads out onto the moor. There were indications that Sir Charles had stood for some little time here. He then proceeded down the alley, and it was at the far end of it that his body was discovered. One fact which has not been explained is the statement of Barrymore that his master's footprints altered their character from the time he passed the moor gate, and that he appeared from thence onwards to have been walking upon his toes. One Murphy, a gipsy horse dealer, was on the moor at the time, but he appears to have been the worse for drink. He declares that he heard cries, but is unable to state from what direction they came. No signs of violence were to be discovered upon Sir Charles's person, though there was an incredible facial distortion. The post-mortem examination showed long-standing organic disease, and the coroner's jury returned a verdict in accordance with the medical evidence. It is understood that the next of kin is Mr. Henry Baskerville, a nephew of Sir Charles who was last heard of in Canada. Dr. Mortimer refolded his paper and replaced it in his pocket. Those, Mr. Holmes, are the public facts. Sherlock Holmes leaned back, put his fingertips together, and assumed his most impassive and judicial expression. Then let me have the private ones. Dr. Mortimer looked uncomfortable. In doing so, I'm telling that which I have not confided to anyone. Within the last few months, it became increasingly plain to me that Sir Charles's nervous system was strained to breaking point. He'd taken this legend exceedingly to heart, so much so that although he'd walk in his own grounds, nothing would induce him to go out upon the moor at night. The idea of some ghastly presence constantly haunted him. One night, when he greeted me at his hall door, I saw his eyes fix themselves over my shoulder and stare past me with an expression of the most dreadful horror. I whisked around and had just time to catch a glimpse of something which I took to be a large black calf passing at the head of the drive. So excited and alarmed was he that I was compelled to go down to the spot where the animal had been and look around for it. It was gone, however, but the incident stayed with him all the evening. It was on my advice that Sir Charles was about to go to London. The constant anxiety in which he lived was evidently having a serious effect upon his health, and I thought a few months among the distractions of town would send him back a new man. At the last instant came this terrible catastrophe. On the night of Sir Charles's death, Barrymore called me, and I was at Baskerville Hall within the hour. I corroborate all the facts which were mentioned at the inquest, but one false statement was made. Barrymore didn't observe any traces on the ground round the body, but I did, some little distance off, but fresh and clear. Holmes leaned forward. A man's or a woman's? Dr. Mortimer turned pale. Mr. Holmes, they were the footprints of a gigantic hound.
Hugh Laurie has been reading The Hound of the Baskervilles by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. The programme was abridged and produced for Radio 2 by Jane Marshall Productions.